everybody. Thanks for showing up. Really appreciate it. Today we have Chris German with us today. Chris is a marine geoscientist who specializes in the exploration for and study of submarine vents. He earned a BA in Natural Sciences at the University of Cambridge in Advanced Chemistry and Geological Sciences, and then ended up staying for a PhD in Marine Geochemistry. Following a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at MIT, which provided him with his first dives in the submersible Alvin, he returned to the UK as a full-time researcher at the UK's National Oceanographic Centre for Science. He returned to the US to take up his current position as a senior scientist at Winslow Oceanographic in 2005, but for the first decade, he also doubled as the chief scientist for the National Deep Submergence Facility. In 2015, Chris received an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Research Prize, and during that year abroad in Germany, he first began to pay serious attention to ocean worlds. And in 2020, he was selected to found and co-lead the NASA Astrobiology Program with Network for Ocean Worlds. And then, just on a more personal note, Chris was my postdoc advisor, and so I was out in Winslow for the last year getting to hang out with him, and I've learned a lot with him, and I think I'm really excited for him to share what he's thinking about with everyone here at UT. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everyone, both online and in the room, for being here. So, yeah, this is a kind of a, if the experiment hadn't worked, I wouldn't be here. But about 10 years ago was when I was on sabbatical. I'd been interested in ocean worlds research for a while, and I'd been buying a lot of stuff, and I'd been writing some proposals that were pretty half-baked and getting turned down. But after about 10 years, I got to spend 6 months in a farmhouse one winter in northern Germany, where it was, in the afternoons, I was hanging out with the department who were my hosts, and in the evening, I was hanging out with the people in the US on their time zone. But in the mornings, nobody knew what I was doing. And it turned out I was sitting in this farmhouse with a big table and all the books that I'd bought in the previous 5 years or so about ocean worlds that I'd never read. And it was kind of humbling for 2 reasons. And the first one was like, no wonder my proposals got rejected. If I'd actually read any of this stuff before I wrote the proposals, I wouldn't have made myself look quite so stupid. So now I've read them, maybe there's a hope. But it was also the same year where the instruments that were going to get flown on Europa Clipper got selected. So it was also oh wow, so the only mission that's going to actually get to completion in my research career has already left the station. So it's probably too late to get involved as well. But even so, I kept reading and thinking, well, maybe there is something we can do that, even if you can't actually influence what the mission's going to do, maybe you can actually influence the understanding of what the data is going to mean when the mission happens. So that was kind of really where I came in. And my starting point of where I thought I might have something to contribute was actually something I'd been doing as part of my own oceanographic research. So in the late 1990s, I'd started getting pretty good at looking for submarine hydrothermal vents just for their own sake. It was an interesting, hydrothermal vents aren't boring. I was quite happy doing something cool of my own. And then I came across this paper in JGR Planets that Everett Schock and his graduate student at the time, Mitch Schulte, who's now the program manager for Mars at NASA headquarters, had published, where they'd actually done a theoretical study. And it was kind of cool. The paper was called The Origins of Life on the Early Earth and Mars. And it didn't mention ocean worlds because in 1998, none existed. Or at least they hadn't been proven, right? They were all out there. It's just nobody was actually talking about them because the first, the Galileo stuff hadn't definitively proven there was an ocean on Europa, for example. So it was a nice idea, but it may or may not have existed. But in the paper, what they were hypothesizing was that in the early Earth, when the Earth was a lot hotter and you were erupting different kinds of lavas, if you then equilibrated a seawater-type solution with carbon dioxide with that kind of rock, what would happen spontaneously, even in the absence of life, is that all of the carbon dioxide, as you cooled that fluid from typical hydrothermal vents, temperatures on the seafloor today, as you cooled them past about 200 degrees, you would quantitatively convert all of that carbon that was present as carbon dioxide into simple organic molecules. So you would have had abiotic synthesis that could have started building some of the foundational molecules that you needed for life. And the tone of the paper was kind of, because it's Everett Schock and you can read between the lines, it turns out, if you actually get to know the guy, which I didn't until afterwards, but I thought I could read it between the lines anyway, was, here's this really clever idea, it's great theory, nobody has a time machine, you can't prove me wrong, deal with it. And so that was kind of a cool paper. And what really attracted me as well was that as an undergraduate doing geology, I'd actually had done a whole course on Archean geology, where I had learned about the fact that this resonated with me because during the early Earth, there were lavas that erupted called komatiites. They have a freezing temperature of about 1600 degrees Celsius, which is significantly hotter than the basalts, which are the hottest rocks that you can erupt at the seafloor today. They erupt at about 1100 degrees. These things at 1600 degrees had quite different composition. And so that was the idea, is those kind of lavas don't erupt, and they haven't for the last half of Earth history. So for the first 2000 million years of Earth history, you could get these things. But you can't since. And so that was Everett's point, is so you won't get this anymore. And so it's actually been kind of fun because I've just been writing a historical review for a new geophysical monograph where I actually managed to get one of my former undergraduate tutors out of retirement to dig out the original photographs of this stuff. So it was published in EPSL in 1975, but the reproduction quality was pretty lousy, so we actually get much nicer photographs. And what this is showing are these diagnostic things. These circular systems are called pillow basalts. So they're a very diagnostic thing from the seafloor. It's a shape and a morphology you only get when lavas erupt underwater. So it's definitely an underwater eruption. What happens is they kind of come as tubes. Imagine like extruding the tube from toothpaste. And as they sit one on top of another, then they settle down into the curved surfaces of the previous one. So you end up with these little cuspate shapes. So you can even tell which way up the lava was. So here's a geological hammer for scale. These are ones from 3.5 billion years on land in an uplifted bit of an ancient ocean floor in South Africa, or somewhere south in the African continent. So unambiguously an underwater lava eruption, but the composition of these things is exactly the kind of rocks that Everett had been doing his calculations for. And it turned out I didn't need a time machine. I'd actually found that I'd actually just found some hydrothermal. Well, I found a first evidence for something like this about 2 years before I read that paper. So it was like, oh, that's interesting. It turns out that back in the day, like 2000 million years ago, back in the day, if you'd actually wanted to find this kind of hydrothermal system, you'd have had to go to the most volcanically active kind of seafloor there's ever been on our planet. Perversely, today you can go to the same place by going to the least volcanically active mid-ocean ridge spreading centers on Earth. Because if you get these systems where the ridge, because basically plate tectonics works where it's actually the subduction zones are pulling plates apart, rather than volcanism is actually pushing stuff out. And so melting happens by decompression. But if you're only pulling the plates apart really slowly, it turns out you can just get really long-lived faults where you can bring stuff up to the surface. And you don't necessarily get any magmatism. If you don't go fast enough, you never actually generate enough melt that you don't get eruptions at the seafloor. So all along about half of the Middle Atlantic Ridge, and if you go to even slower spreading ridges, and this one's from the Mid-Cayman Rise, the theory is you can get a fault that remains active for a couple of million years, which means eventually all the ocean crust that's made of the same composition as basalt gets slid out of the way, and you start bringing up stuff in the mantle. Now it turns out that's where the stuff that used to erupt on the seafloor, that's where it crystallizes out nowadays. On the modern Earth, where it actually becomes solid is 6 kilometers down. So normally, if you go into somewhere that's got a lot of volcanic activity, you never see this stuff, and seawater can never get near it. But if you go to really slow spreading ridges, then you can actually get this stuff exposed at the seafloor with deep penetrating cracks, where the cracks can actually then access the geothermal gradient, and so you can get fluid can flow down those cracks, can interact with that seawater and come back out. And it took, and so this is an explicit case. This is one from the Mid-Cayman Rise called Mount Dent. And there's a hydrothermal vent there, which I think it was my 4th attempt to get this right. I used to joke when I was halfway through this program, because intellectually, there should be a way you could go to a place like this and you could find abiotic organic synthesis happening in the modern day. And then I used to joke, but nobody will let me sterilize the ocean. So I can't prove that the organic stuff that's coming out of the vent isn't stuff that's gone down because it just hasn't been broken down. It could be pre-existing organic matter in Earth's ocean that is going down, and it's never going through the chemically corrosive conditions to actually break it down into carbon dioxide because it's buffered by these things. So it took us a few times, but eventually in 2015, we came up with an idea of if we actually used radiocarbon dating, we could prove this is brand new stuff that's gone down through the cycle and has been synthesized into small organic molecules that are young and have come back out again. So we got to do that, and it's kind of cute that the place we found it was actually somewhere that it could have been found in 1976. 6 months before the first vents were found on the Galapagos Rift in 1977. There'd been an Alvin dive expedition that had actually wanted to go and study this system. So they started as deep as Alvin could go at 4,000 meters and worked their way up slope. So they had this dive, then this dive, then this dive. Then they wanted to see if things were different. So they went somewhere else on the hill and went up this dive. And then they went over here because they found some of these more interesting rocks down here. And then it was like they had one dive left, and it's like, we're damned if we're going home and not getting to the top of the hill. And we can see how long these lines are. So where do we have to start? If we jump forward, where can we go to make sure we get to the top of the summit before the cruise is over? So they went through in 1976. 1977, they found the first vents in the Galapagos Rift. I started college about the same time. I went through graduate school. I finally wrote strong enough essays in my finals to get a scholarship or PhD saying you can't have hydrothermal vents on slow spreading ridges because people looked and they didn't find them. So I wrote it because that's what I was taught. And that's what I had to do to get the grades, but I never believed it. Because the whole thing was, a geologist will tell you a basalt has frozen solid, right? And you can hit it with a hammer so it sounds loud. But it could still be 1,000 degrees Celsius. If you put your hand on it, you wouldn't want to touch it. There's still a lot of heat there. So it never made sense to me that the seafloor shouldn't have vents everywhere. That's really where I got into doing this exploration. But what I didn't realize was I was going to find a completely different category of vents. So that was really where we went. And so this was the study we did. This was Jill McDermott's paper that actually showed, from a chemistry perspective, that here's what the carbon dioxide should be that was young. That's what you should get on a mixing line. And here, with fluids that are in that 250 degrees Celsius, what you'd actually do is that the CO2 would go missing. You would generate formate, which is a very simple mediator of these things. If you sum the formate and the carbon dioxide concentrations together, you end up straight back on this mixing line between the vent fluid and seawater. So you can actually close the loop. All the carbon dioxide that goes missing, you can account for in the formate that gets generated. So yeah, it took 10 years and 4 different research expeditions, but we got there. It was worth it. And then the other thing we found at the same time was working with some microbiologists in Julie Huber's lab. We were able to show that these systems that were very hydrogen rich, that's one of the diagnostics of these particular hydrothermal systems, that's what makes them so chemically reducing. They have free hydrogen. So free hydrogen is the best reductant you can have on the planet. And so anything to the right of that is more oxidized and can be reduced. And that's how you can actually drive things towards organic synthesis. It also turned out that these things also have the greatest energy. It's not just a great place to study abiotic organic synthesis, but it's also a place where you can go and look at some of the most primitive microbes. If you reconstruct a DNA tree of life, the things that hang out right down at the bottom, the most primitive sort of common ancestors, are hydrogen-loving plants. They like warm water, they like chemically reducing environments, they specifically like working with hydrogen. And this is a slight distraction. I carried on doing that kind of work. The reason I went to the Caribbean was I told NASA that's where I had to go first if I wanted to go to the Arctic and find vents under an ice-covered ocean, and NASA fell for it. So that's good. But I'm not going to talk about that today, just to let you know it's something that happened. I put it in the abstract and realized I wouldn't have time. So there we go. That was it. Link and you missed it. So what I'm really going to talk about today is starting from that premise of oh, we might be onto something here. It then became a larger project over the last 5 years of being, what else is there that oceanographers know and take for granted that could be fed into exploration of ocean worlds, where planetary scientists have great theories, great ideas, great technique, great places to go, but limited data. To what extent can we actually bring processes to try and work with that data to come up with new hypotheses of what could be happening, and is there a there? That was really what the 5-year program was about. So we set up this program. We started off, there was a group of 12 PIs who drew on my blackboard remotely via Zoom over about a year. And we came up with a schematic of what are all the physical processes we might think we'd come up with. Then we managed to reduce that down to this idea of what are some investigations we could put together into that program from the interior out. So it's very much a, missions kind of can look at the outside of a planet and then infer what must be happening down below. And we were trying to do the reverse journey of what do we think could be happening at the bottom? And if we worked our way up, what would you expect to see on the outside? And see if we could meet halfway. And then we had a really good illustrator at Hui, and she came out with this conceptual model when she came and like talked with us of like, what are you trying to do? And she came back and said, do you like that? And we liked it so much we made stickers as well. So we had a logo of our Wi-Fi project. So here's what I'm going to talk through some of the areas of things that did work. It's not everything, but it's some illustrations of things that I thought were kind of useful. So I'll start with the subsea floor hydrogeology. This is stuff that was mostly Andy Fisher and Donna Blackman at the UC Santa Cruz were the drivers on this, and Christophe Sotan from JPL was. We had like resident planetary people on our project as well, just to keep us honest and make sure we didn't go too far astray. Because I think if we were left as on our own as oceanographers, that probably could have happened. And so we started off with the first thing was, okay, we can't require any other planet to have plate tectonics because that's a weird, wonderful thing that we have on Earth. But if you just took something that has pre-existing topography or any kind of heterogeneity on the seafloor and you covered it in seawater, would something happen? And so that was the hydrogeologists were like, yeah, actually, you probably would. First thing to tell you is the thing you would find is not when people talk about seafloor fluid flow on ocean worlds, please don't ever think of a black smoker again. The high heat flow thing is, well, in fact, I can even get Yoda-ish of like, these are not the vents you were looking for. Okay, because these are really hot, they're really toxic, they're really corrosive. Nothing would want to live there anyway. They don't want to live there on our planet. So even if you did think they were there, you wouldn't want to find them. That isn't a place where you'd want to look. But more to the case is we probably don't think there's enough heat flow to sustain something like that anyway. So that's not realistic. So where we started from instead was by recruiting Andy Fisher as part of our team, was to start thinking about the kind of stuff he's worked on of if you're on mid-ocean ridge flanks where there's some finite heat flux available, and you've got some kind of aquifer, can you sustain fluid circulation? So we started, the nice thing here was that this is something that he'd been working on with colleagues at Los Alamos National Laboratory for about a decade. So they had a really nice model on ocean circulation already set up. And then all we did was just change one parameter. So this is not us saying this is what happens on other ocean worlds. It's just saying a thing on Earth that can sustain long-term circulation, which dominates the flux of water and heat and mass on our planet in terms of seafloor hydrothermal activity, operates at this gravity. Now, what happens if we go to Europa gravity or Enceladus gravity? Can you sustain that same kind of siphon flow? And the answer is that for Europa, you can. For Enceladus, you might well be able to. There's certain circumstances where the siphon the circulation fails, but a lot of the time it keeps going. And certainly for Europa, it's actually more like, well, then you'd have to try and defy the laws of physics to stop it happening, unless you had a completely perfect sphere, which is what we see in the cross sections for Europa, right? Because we don't know any better. So in the absence of data, we have these beautiful seamless interior spheres, but unless that holds, then you should expect there to be some kind of circulation that would happen that would go through at some kind of temperature. And the interesting thing is that if you do that, because gravity is weaker, then the buoyancy fluxes are less of what's actually driving the circulation, which actually chokes the flow. So then the water that's passing through the seafloor would be moving more slowly. And then two really great things come out of that if you're interested in habitability. One of them is, how do you stop all the heat getting mined out so fast that life can never get established? And here it's like, actually, well, you just choke off the flow, so the flow will just last longer, so you get more time of water getting warmed up in the subsurface. And then the second thing is, the slower the fluid flows, then each pass of water is like then encompassing, it's encountering the same geothermal gradient for longer, so there's more time for things to get warmed up. So you can actually get into some interesting, maybe you can get to higher temperatures than you might expect otherwise on a like-for-like basis on Earth, which means maybe you can get better chemical reactions with the rocks as the water's passing through, so you can actually release more of the chemicals that you're relying on for chemistry. So the original paper was done in 2 dimensions. There's been a newer paper you can read from Rua Kiba, a student of Andy's, who started modeling this in 3 dimensions and think about the fact that it's not just a 2-dimensional slice. If you look at it from above, you can imagine that from the downflow point to the outflow point, it's probably some kind of big circular trajectory. There's all kinds of, there's a huge tree of pathways in 3D that things can be following. But the other thing that Donna Blackman has been working on is actually seeing if she can actually trace what the temperature might be in the convection rolls along this pathway. So actually coming up with temperature fields of what might be plausible. And the reason this is exciting, and I persuaded her to actually come out of retirement a second time and actually write the results up, is that the temperatures that she gets are somewhere in the, this is kind of like in the less than 10 degrees Celsius. But in here, sorry, you can't see it on the scale, but this is above blue is 40 degrees Celsius. This gets to 120 degrees. The limit to life that we know on Earth is 127 degrees Celsius. If you take a microbiologist to see and they're trying to look on hydrothermal stuff, their favorite incubation temperatures are around 50 degrees and 80 degrees Celsius. Those are standard temperatures, but when things are in a really happy sweet spot. So it turns out that these roles, if you actually do an animation, they actually progress. They're not static cells. They're permanently moving, but there's always fluid and rock moving. So you're always getting fresh fluid rock interaction spaces at temperatures that are cycling in these tens of degrees in a very healthy position. So that's what's come out of the study, and that's kind of what we're using as a springboard for some of what comes next. But just for yucks, because I come all the way from oceanography, this is an example of what life could look like in vents that are about those 30 to 50 degrees Celsius. You look at these little fingers here, don't know if it's too light, but there's some little Schlieren effect. So there's warm water coming out of these things. Remember, these are not the black smokers that people are used to when they say they're about hydrothermal activity. But these are pretty benign temperatures. The dark orange here is iron oxide that's been left behind by microbial activity. But all the pale areas here are active microbes. So these are very habitable environments. They're in those tens of degrees Celsius range, things like it. So if you can, it's kind of exciting to think that there are ways that we might imagine things like that could be happening at the seafloor of other ocean worlds. And so if you can have that kind of physics, what might you be getting from the subsoil seafloor biogeochemistry? And this really got a lot of impetus in the around 2015. In fact, it was pretty much at exactly the same time we were publishing that study from the Cayman Rise saying, hey, we've actually found a natural laboratory on Earth with abiotic organic synthesis. That Hunter Waite and his crew from Cassini published that they'd actually, in their 2015 flypast, this was like October of 2015, had actually found carbon dioxide and hydrogen and methane all coexisting together, or they found evidence for that in the plume data from the Cassini mission. Where in particular, basically, these two are unstable in the presence of one another. So there's an oxidant and a reactant available. So it's like, okay, well, the chemistry of Enceladus, apparently, if these plumes are coming up from the ocean, actually have the right kind of reactants that you might want to have to drive some kind of some kind of biological productivity, potentially, or abiotic organic synthesis. And in particular, the thing is, it's this hydrogen. It's the presence of a system that has hydrogen in it is the thing that really makes things exciting. This is just be up to get, again, this is a low temperature. This is getting up to about 90 or 100 degrees Celsius. This is a hydrothermal system. That's the one that actually had the abiotic organic synthesis going on. And the reason it gets like a lot of publicity is that that's the thing that when Hunter Waite and Chris Klein wanted to like put out publicity to go with their science paper of, oh, well, we've just discovered this thing, but it needs a, and Sean Su's paper before that as well, silicon nanoparticles from Enceladus. That was some of the first evidence for there being some kind of hydrothermal activity on Enceladus. They had to say, but it's not like anyone's seen yet, because here are these criteria. It needs to be not too hot, but it has to have some silica in it, and it has to have hydrogen, and it has to have CO2, and it has to have methane. And yeah, we know black smokers don't have that. And it turned out that our student Jill went on a postdoc with the same lab that Chris Klein was at, who was about to head to Hunter's lab. They knew each other, and it was like, oh wait, Jill, didn't you just find a vent that describes what we found? Which is kind of weird. So again, oceanography was only just catching up in time to be of any use. Don't you think the Cassini mission had launched? The Cassini was doing its extended mission 6 months before the extended mission made the most outrageous discovery of, oh, there's hydrogen in the jets of water coming out of Enceladus. It's like, we just found that. It's okay. It's not like you're not having to invent something that doesn't exist anywhere. So what's been happening then was like, okay, so that's a location, right? But it's not one of these like unique fits of, oh, those are all the parameters you've got. Here's the vent site that explains it. No, it's like, here's a vent site that just has the right criteria that it's not impossible. Like, there is a way you can do this. What are all the other ways you might be able to generate exactly the same chemistry? So Nuri Park, working with Everett Schnock, as basically his PhD is just wrapping up now. He basically went and took an entire database of all the basaltic rocks on the seafloor to start with, and said, okay, or all the basaltic rocks, all the ultramafic rocks, so you what they plotted in compositional space, and then said, okay, if we think the key thing that releases hydrogen is a reaction that's oxidizing iron 2, let's go pick 5 different rocks out of all these gazillions of rocks that have the same iron concentration, and then say, okay, then iron is not a variable here, other things are, and then what happens to the oxidation of iron and the generation of hydrogen? And what he was able to show was if you are doing things at low temperature, it really matters what your rock composition is. If you've got high magnesium concentrations, if you're in these ultramafic rocks I've been obsessing about, it's quite easy to generate lots of hydrogen. If you're in these more silicic rocks, so if you have a differentiated, that's the next slide, but if you have more silicic rocks, then you don't generate nearly as much hydrogen at low temperature. But if you heat things up to high temperature in the subsea floor, then you can actually get high hydrogen out of pretty much everything. So when you see high hydrogen, it isn't necessarily diagnostic. It doesn't necessarily require a certain rock type at the seafloor of Enceladus. It requires a certain rock type at the seafloor of Enceladus if the circulation temperature is below a certain threshold. Another way of looking at the same problem is the second paper that Nuri is working on, which is to say, well, then what about Europa? You know, there's discussions of is the interior of Europa differentiated or not differentiated, and why would we care? And again, it gets the same thing, that you end up with really quite different compositions. This is the aluminum to silica ratio against the iron concentration. So differentiated rocks and undifferentiated, what the seafloor is made of would be quite different in that case of what's the seabed. And again, if you're actually working at low temperature, it really makes a difference, right? That the undifferentiated stuff has a pathway to making lots and lots of hydrogen-rich fluid. The undifferentiated rocks are really underperforming. Sorry, the differentiated ones. But again, if you go to higher temperature, everything converges again. So there's a thing of like, it's just to illustrate that there's not like unique solutions. There's multiple different paths to get to some of the things. When we've got data, we can say, okay, here's this data of a hydrogen-rich something at the seafloor of Enceladus, and we can be very swayed to go like, okay, that just means it's a vent like this. And it's like, no, it could be that, or it could be any one of these other things as well. We haven't really been as diagnostic as we like. Another thing that comes in is that it turns out that the composition, all those rock projects I just showed you, were actually just taking fresh water and reacting them with the rocks. If you start messing with the composition of the solution of the seawater as well, of what the water composition is, that can also start affecting things. So Tucker Ely spent a lot of time, he was another grad student of Everett's, and then for his postdoc, he then worked out how could you actually take a variation of the same model that could be run much more efficiently on computers so that you could actually, instead of taking 15 minutes per sample, you could run lots and lots of different parameters. So he did this first of all, this is a ternary diagram for ultramafic rocks, and this is against water rock ratio at the bottom and different temperatures, and coming up with plots of under these systems, which ones are better for hydrogen, which ones are not. So you can see, you know, if you go to lower temperatures, then you need just the right water rock ratio. As you go to higher temperatures, it really doesn't matter anymore. Certain point, if you get to high enough temperatures, then you can generate lots of hydrogen-rich fluid. Once you've done that for one ocean composition, and you had the ability to do millions of runs in a day, he then went back and said, okay, well then in 13-dimensional space, I can now take all these different things that might be major contributors to ocean chemistry and look at what's permissible on a mineral by mineral basis. So all of this data are probability clouds for lots of different parameters if the seafloor has magnetite in it. So if your ocean is equilibrated with magnetite, and he just picked magnetite because that's an end product of serpentinization reactions. But he has the ability to do that. You come up with a mineral, anything you want, he can now run a program and come up with this. Here's the probability cloud of what your ocean composition might be like, which is really cool, right? And that just sounds aesthetically like a nice thing to have, and I did make a lot of use of it with him. But we actually have one case study where we already did that, a microbiology PhD student at Woods Hole with Judy Huber was going out to work in Guam. There's a bunch of mud volcanoes. This is another environment where you get a lot of serpentinization reactions can happen. So she went out, and basically the idea is that there are different ways you can get ultramafic rocks. You can get high temperature things like the ones I first found at Rainbow. You can get things like the Von Dam site, which are of moderate pH, or you can get these things at high alkalinity, which seems to be more the preferred predictions for what might be happening on Enceladus. So this became a better environment than the others we've been to, and it turned out to arm these mud volcanoes and subduction zone. Like, okay, the tectonic setting is not anything you'd expect on these other planets, but it is a way that on Earth you can actually get the right kind of water rock reactions taking place. So Sabrina went out, took isolates from these places, and then working with Tucker, was able to calculate what a predicted Enceladus ocean would be. And so she actually started growing her microbes not in ordinary seawater, not in hydrothermal fluid, but she made synthetic Enceladus ocean and started growing her stuff in there. And has been having a lot of fun with that. So this is, again, I'm kind of advertising what lots of other people have done in a project that I put together rather than anything that I actually know about, because I was just busy making sure they all got funded. But this is stuff that Sabrina defended her thesis in December, and so she has a paper coming on that. But it kind of shows the utility. It's not just empirically you can generate all kinds of wonderful predictions about what an ocean's saltwater composition might be, but then you can actually use that in judicious selection of experiments that you conduct. Okay, so don't know a lot about what's happening beneath the seafloor. Another thing that comes in is what might be happening in the oceans of these ocean worlds. And so there's another function there. This is one of the perspectives. This is the group that I worked with were from MIT. They used the MIT global circulation model. So these are people who are very much into oceanographic, physical oceanography. And so this paper from 2023 was saying, okay, well, some of the important things are what's the aspect ratio of your ocean and what's the rotation rate of the planetary body you're in? And all else being equal, if we put in geothermal heat fluxes of the kind that are in the literature, what might you expect to happen, and would they look the same? So this is kind of cool for Enceladus. You can really get the idea that if you put in some buoyancy at the bottom, an important thing, something I should have told you first. On Earth, in the oceans, the main thing that drives ocean circulation is wind and interaction with the atmosphere. That's where you get transfer of energy, transfer of heat. On an icy ocean world where you've got a complete coverage of ice, then you don't get that. So on Earth, you get a thing called thermohaline circulation. So it's a combination of both. Is the water warm or cold? Is it salty or fresh? On other oceans, all you can get is haline circulation. It's driven by salt. But if the ocean is pretty well mixed from top to bottom, if you put in something with a little bit of buoyancy at the bottom, then if the ocean is set up the right way, it'll just keep rising. It might have less and less buoyancy as it rises, but it'll always be a little bit more buoyant than the seawater is being intruded into if it starts off warm, for example, at the bottom of the ocean. For Enceladus, on a like-for-like basis, the predictions are it's actually a lot harder to get the stuff from the bottom to the top. So in fact, it might actually be the stuff's basically filling at the bottom of the ocean rather than actually making it all the way to the top. Which then becomes, okay, well then if that is the only process, which it probably isn't, but if that was the thing that was driving everything, how are we going to get, then we need to think about over what kind of timescales can this stuff fill up so that if you had a signal, another big assumption, if your habitable space was actually where the water comes out of the rocks into the ocean, if that's where the key habitable niche is, like it is on Earth, where we have an oxygenated ocean and a reducing environment in the subsea floor, then if this is the area where life might be able to get hold, then where would your biosignatures go from? And in Europa, you can imagine, okay, there might be a really quite straightforward path for those biosignatures to get up to the top of the ocean and out. On Enceladus, it might be a lot tricky. You might just have to wait an awfully long time for it to fill from the bottom. And if Enceladus has been around for billions of years and it's been doing lots of chemistry for all that time, then it may well have gone to completion and be full all the way up to the brim. But there's other things as well. I put this in just in case there's anybody here from the Reason project, just to say when you do know about the ice shelf thickness of an icy moon, there's extra things you can do. So this is Wang Ying Pang, still in that same group at MIT, was able to come up with the idea that if you do have differences in ice shelf thickness, like you do from the equator to the pole and Enceladus apparently, then you can actually deduce more about the ocean circulation patterns. And one of the key things that I'm most excited about in all of that is that you can actually end up having stratified layers. So basically the idea is that if you've got thick ice and it's deeper, then you can get freezing there. And so you can actually get, you can basically extrude or leave behind saltier water, which will sink. That will actually drive flow down to the sea bottom at the equator. It will flow polewards. It will come back up under the poles. But rather than coming straight up, it might actually get deflected because up here where it's warm, you may actually have relatively fresh water where there's melting. So if that is happening, you may actually, and we don't know how strong that stratification can be, but conceptually there's a thing to worry about there, that you may actually have these layers that are blocked off. The thing I know about from my PhD are anoxic basins like the Black Sea. There's like a whole deep basin that is completely anoxic, and then there's a chemical horizon halfway up the water column, and the top of the ocean layer is a different composition to what's down below. So then that's something that keeps me up at night is, okay, well, it's that thin bit, that's where the jets are of the South Polar terrain from Enceladus. So if that's the water we're sampling in Cassini, we may actually, in the worst case scenario, we may just be tapping into this stuff and not the stuff that's come up from below. But we haven't solved that, that's just that. The kinds of things to keep me up at night. So it does kind of like give us a framework then from the ocean physics of, well, okay, well then how do we make sense of what we do see coming out of Enceladus? So that's the next stage. I kind of backed a winner here and just said, okay, the thing that I'm going to rely on is that there's a secret in oceanography is that particles in the ocean carry a lot more information than the dissolved stuff in the ocean. So little things, and this kind of comes mostly from photosynthesis. Like there's a thing called a biological carbon pump, which is basically things grow on the surface, they sink, they react, they get transported from one place to another, they get chemical disequilibria, they can be these like little micro ecosystems. But that doesn't have to only be in photosynthesis, it's also the same kind of thing. This is some examples from hydrothermal systems that a colleague of ours, Brandy Toner, has specialized in. So this is like that's a 1 micron scale bar. So you can take these things and take a particle that's retained on a filter. And it's clearly not just a single thing, right? It's an agglomeration of all kinds of stuff, organic and inorganic, mineral, not mineral. And so you can actually map these things out and find, okay, well, here's where carbon is. This is where the iron 2 is. So you can see, oh, the carbon's actually kind of in the same place where the iron 2 is in these particles that are in an oxidizing ocean. So that's exactly the place where you'd expect the redox reaction to be happening. It seems to be gathering carbon to it, and in the same particles on a grain by grain basis, you can actually then do spectra and actually characterize what kinds of stuff are there. So you can see here, for example, here are different real world particle samples, and then here's some ideas of like, well, that's what a polysaccharide would look like, here's what a protein would look like, here's what a lipid would look like. I missed one of my lines out, but there are certain peaks you can see here in these samples. You can see coming up through here things that look very much like stuff that might be biological in nature, not just organic background. And putting those two together, this is the most recent synthesis we've been working on is, okay, well, if you combine the idea of maybe circulation on Enceladus is kind of weird or problematic, and it doesn't have to be, there's like different ways you can configure it. But you can actually get to this idea of maybe it's years to tens of years to get from the bottom to the top. And the reason that's a concern is that for the silica story from Enceladus, the paper that first set us off down the path of thinking there was hydrothermal activity on Enceladus was requiring that there was silica that was being ejected or formed at the seafloor at a hydrothermal system and then being transported through a corrosive ocean where it would be dissolving as it went, and had to come out and actually get ejected out into the plume and into the E-ring on short timescales. And then our circulation patterns say, we can't actually do that. We don't know how to do a circulation that would actually get it out in time. And so this is actually what Tucker's, a different thing Tucker's done is with his ability to predict different kind of ocean compositions. Like here's all the possible ocean compositions on Enceladus with different minerals that you get from serpentinization that could explain why there's hydrogen and methane in these samples and CO2. And then you can compare and contrast how long it actually takes. Well, this is like the least generous and the most generous amount of time that a silica particle could actually stick around in the ocean and not get dissolved. But then here's the transit time. So you really just can't get to, at the moment, we can't come up with a mechanism, or you can't easily, if the stuff's just ocean circulating, there's a kind of problem of how do you get the silica out if it's actually forming at a hydrothermal system on the seafloor. The good news is this does not negate hydrothermal activity on the seafloor of Enceladus. You still need some kind of fluid flow because you wouldn't have the hydrogen and the CO2 and the methane coexisting. So that's the good news. Everyone can relax if you care about Enceladus. Having hydrothermal activity on Enceladus has not been violated. But the silica interpretation means you can't necessarily put the same constraints on temperature that you might want to. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what else could you do? One of the options that's entirely plausible is that maybe you have a vent on the seafloor that's got a gas phase as well. Everyone thinks about how deep these oceans are, right? On these other planetary bodies, they're much, much deeper than Earth's oceans. But if you scale that against the gravity, the pressure is actually pretty familiar to oceanographers. The seafloor of Europa might be a bit deeper than the deepest trenches on Earth. But if you go to Enceladus, it's only like the equivalent of 1,000 meters deep. So it could be like the same shallow, isolated volcanoes we get in the middle of hotspots. We know we have volcanoes in space, right? You look at Io, you can look at Mars. Single point volcanoes are not a difficult thing to infer geologically in places. So it's perfectly plausible, and that's deeper than the seafloor of Enceladus that had, in this case, it was a magmatic system with a lot of carbon dioxide coming out. But you could imagine a system where there could actually be a mechanism that does that. Or there could be an even simpler thing, which is that somebody who gate crashed our project was Melissa Diaz, who was a postdoc who came to Woods Hole working on cryospheres, but got interested in what we were doing. She was listening to us all like, well, how do we get these silicon nanoparticles up to the surface and out through the ice-ocean interface? And she said, you do realize they form at the ice-ocean interface all the time. But if you take any ocean that has any dissolved silica in it, and then you cool it down to the temperatures that you get at the ice-ocean interface, you spontaneously start generating silicon nanoparticles. So in fact, there could be two completely different explanations. Yes, there's hydrothermal activity at the bottom, and that's giving you the hydrogen and the methane, but the jet on its way out could be stripping up silicon nanoparticles that they could actually come in from a completely different source. It's just coincidence. They have to be in the same sample that Cassini measured, but we just set off down a different path. So that's the next thing we started getting into then, or right at the end of the project, was that Melissa started looking at okay, well then how does stuff get mapped into? How do you go from the ocean to the ice and vice versa? Ours isn't the only project that's done that, but because we've been up to the Arctic, we actually had some ice cores that went through to the ice-ocean interface that we brought back frozen. So we just got our first paper coming out, which is actually then taking these samples, and conventionally, when people are doing things like climate records in Greenland, they just take a big tube of ice like this, they drill down, get a core, and they just slice it every centimeter and look at chemistry. And so that's this kind of data. That's what we had as old-fashioned data. And then what Melissa and I came up with was the idea of, well, what if you put this in a CAT scan and you actually look at where the brine channels are? Because we know that when ice forms, it forms freshwater ice. To a first approximation, people say, oh, and then all the salt is left behind, and that's why you get thermohaline circulation, because cold, salty water sinks, and that's what drives ocean circulation. But it's an imperfect process. So you can actually trap in salty brine in those ice cores. At those high concentrations, you might have high nutrient concentrations. They could, while they're still liquid, be really kind of interesting little habitable niches themselves near the ice-ocean interface. But they're also, because they're the last things to freeze in, they would actually be, if you warm them up, they will be the first things to melt out as well. So what we've started now, or what Melissa has set up with her startup money in Ohio, is a core that can progressively warm up a core from the base, and the brine can fall out and be carried off into one collection mechanism, and then you heat it up, so we take out the ice separately, so we can actually get the brines and the ice and look at their compositions separately from one another. And then the other thing we're doing, just because Kevin Hand's part of our project, is taking some of these particles and also saying, well, even if you do understand what's happening in the ice-ocean interface, and you do get to one day understand the processes in the ice core and how stuff gets out onto the surface, on Europa in particular, it would be, and then what happens to those samples while they're sitting around waiting for you to show up and get a Europa lander project funded, or get to there and to run the spectrometry on it. So what Kevin has done, because he hates ice, I think, is set up a thing he calls Europa in a can, where he can take freshly generated ice with different sorts and then irradiate them at levels of radiation similar to what they think is happening on the surface of Europa. So this is some of the experiments. We don't have the data yet, but we're starting off with some of the same samples stuff I showed you before, where we can take known real-world samples of marine particles. We can characterize them spectroscopically beforehand, and then we put them through here and take exactly the same samples and reanalyze them again and see what's happened to them, what's happened to the organic molecules, what's happened to the minerals, seeing how those things get perturbed, which should give us an idea of that idea of ripening of if you've got samples sitting around on the surface, what kinds of things might be happening to them, how might that impact? By the time you get there with a mission and you make a measurement, what is another process you have to kind of like decipher? So that's a quick blast through. 12 PIs working for 5 years with about 30 grad students, all in 45 minutes. And so what I'm just going to tell you now is, it's kind of frustrating. I mean, we had COVID in the middle of that as well, but it seemed like we promised a lot in 5 years. And what we actually got to was, okay, we've got some interesting frameworks to work with now. We know, now we have a vocabulary, we know how to articulate some problems of what we want to do. And so what we're moving to now is a new project, which is something much more specific rather than the where can we make a difference. The thing now is, oh, on Earth, there's hardly any dissolved organic carbon sitting around uneaten. So most of the organic carbon on the planet is taken up by life. If you go to a planet that doesn't have, that's too far from the sun and coupled with ice and can't have photosynthesis, the total amount of energy that's available to drive biological life is much less. But if you're starting off with a carbonaceous chondrite, there's a hell of a lot of organic material in that system. So now there's probably a different signal to noise ratio than we've ever thought about before as oceanographers. Because now you're going to have like a tiny amount of biological signature that might be present, or you hope is present. And it's going to be sitting against a much higher background that you're trying to resolve. So a lot of the mission concepts are, here's some diagnostic organic measurements we can make that would be evidence that life is around, even if you don't find a living thing, right? That morphology is one of the things, but results from metabolism, actual products, particular organic material might be other things you'd look at. And so now we're trying to take the kind of mechanisms we have, the kind of systems we know about, and how to parameterize those things and say, okay, what are the different ways that if you had a completely abiotic world, what kind of false negatives could you generate? Or if you did have life present in the same systems, what kind of experiments can we set up that are actually going to go and look at that? So we have, the first theme we're doing is very much this continuing the seafloor theme, so taking the kind of stuff that Andy Fisher had been pioneering, but now layering organic chemistry on top of that with Susan Lang is another one of the investigators. So we're actually thinking about what happens along this aquifer, both in terms of what's going down, what's the kind of fluid that might be coming out, what kind of water rock reactions might you be having, and then setting up experiments that we can do in the interim of like, what happens if you do this in a completely lifeless, sterile system, or what happens if you actually let some kind of microbes be present as well? Does it make a difference to the organic signature that comes out up here? And then the next theme is thinking about, okay, in that water column, if you do get anything interesting coming out here, what are all the different processes we should be worrying about? There are things like, what more can we do to try and understand what could and couldn't be happening on an Enceladus ocean or a Europa ocean, now that we know we've found at least one parameter that can really mess that up and make it bimodal. We can then drill that into probability counts of how would that make a difference to what might happen if you did have any organic material coming out, whether it's from abiotic reactions or from life. And then how much stratification could there be? To what extent should we worry about that? Like, we've come up with it conceptually, now we want to run lots and lots of forward models. And a key part of that is that again, like Tucker Ely had done for the geochemical equilibration model, he'd worked a way to actually get to 90% of the story with 10% of processing power. Wan Ying's now come up with some colleagues in Chicago of how can you take what was the MIT global circulation model that needed a huge amount of processing power and get it down to a thing called Oceanographic, I think it's the super title of it. But it's a model that can actually run on a desktop computer, so you can actually run a lot more. You can basically imagine, we're only 1 month into a 5-year project, we can still keep the dream alive, but what that will allow us to do is come up with so much forward modeling of just the physical circulation and variability there that we can start layering on reaction transport models to start looking at how chemistry might vary. And then a third thing that's kind of interesting that we're thinking about is if the ice shells on Europa and Enceladus are young compared to the ocean planets, or the planets themselves, and there has always been some level of meteoritic infall on the top, where's that stuff gone? And if you presume, which may not be right, that the ice at some point circulates all the way from top to bottom, then at some point, if you get that stuff down to the bottom, maybe some of that silicate material would drop out and would actually settle down to the seafloor and you could get sedimentation. Or if the circulation patterns are strong compared to the amount of gravity, the strength of gravity and settling rate, maybe you have a lot of actual particles just hanging out in the water column and permanently suspended. And maybe that becomes like a new place. People have debated, should we be looking for habitability at the seafloor of an ocean world? Should we be looking, that's great if your ocean is full of oxidants and your subsea floor is full of reductants. And then there's been the other mode that people talked about is, well, maybe for Europa, for example, we're generating oxygen and oxidants at the surface. So maybe if you've got a fully anoxic ocean, then it's at the ocean ice interface, that's the place where the redox chemistry can happen. And now it's, Bradley's been getting really excited about the meteorite returns from Bennu and Ryugu. Is it Ryugu? I'm pronouncing it right. But what if you get these like mineral particles with all kinds of interesting things? They've got some really cool metals that are kind of known as coenzymes, like nickel. What if those things are actually just sprinkling down into the ocean and they're just hanging out in the ocean? Right? So people worry about, oh, well, if stuff's in the ocean, if it's in solution, it's really dilute. Maybe you can never get enough of the right stuff in the right place at the right time. What if you've just got these things that have got huge amounts of surface area compared to volume? You have huge, each one of these little particles, if it is hanging around, there's lots of imagination here. But if you did have that, you could imagine, from Earth, you could imagine a thing that would have lots of really, really good reactive spaces where things could be happening. And then the last part is what might be happening in the last part of the transport, at least for Enceladus. We don't know if Europa has these or not, but if you have got jets of stuff coming out, what are the things that could be happening? What happens above the throat of this thing when you actually evacuate stuff? But what could be happening at the ice-ocean interface as you're moving up through this conduit? There's another surface area there. There's lots of chemical exchange that could be happening there, as well as the physics of that. So I'm sorry I've run long, but that is everything. You will know, I think, that Clipper's on its way. And I've got 5 years before I retire, and then it's going to arrive. So I'm going to do my best to try and get answers to all those ideas faster than Clipper gets on the station. Thank you very much.